But we're looking today at this question of science and faith. How can you believe in God, in the supernatural, in the face of scientific evidence? Often we're presented, aren't we, with this kind of sense of choice. You're either into science, into rationality, into evidence, or you're into faith, you're into God, and you're basically going to have to be irrational and leave your brain at the door. Faith and evidence, faith and God are often seen as opposing things. I remember I was getting my hair cut a while back, and my hairdresser was cutting my hair, as she does, and she asked me what I did for a living, so I was explaining about my profession, and she said, "Oh, I really admire your faith." And I thought that was quite a nice compliment, to be honest. It wasn't my face that she admired, but my faith was a good second best. And so I said to her, and what do you think faith is? And she looked at me, and without hesitating, she said, well, faith is the ability to believe things that aren't true. And I kind of looked at her in the mirror and I said, and do you admire that ability that I have? I think I would pity people that could do things like that. But for a lot of people, that's what faith is. Richard Dawkins said, faith is an evil precisely because it requires no justification and brooks no arguments. Michael Onfray puts it this way: God puts to death everything that stands up to him, beginning with reason, intelligence, and the critical mind. Or slightly more humorously, Mark Twain just put it this way: faith is believing what you know ain't true. But often we're presented with this idea of faith on the one hand, and science and evidence and rationality on the other. And in some ways I'd say this is quite an ironic and strange conclusion that people have come to for various reasons. I mean, firstly, the modern study of science grew out of the Judeo-Christian worldview of Western Europe over the last few hundred years. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. A belief in God lay behind lots of the study of modern science. Just around the corner from here, I walked around there this morning. Come back. There's the Cavendish Laboratory, or the old Cavendish Laboratory, I should say. And some incredible things happened there. They discovered the electron, the helix nature of DNA. I don't know why my iPad is doing that, so that's very frustrating. But if you go and you look outside the door, I might just leave it. Shall we leave it? Can we get the number on the screen somehow? And then we'll just go with that, shall we? But if you look outside the door, you'll just have to take my word for it now because the screen's not working. But you'll see that it's got, in Latin, inscribed the words of Psalm 111. Great are the works of the Lord. So this idea behind the study of modern science, people saying, actually, it was their belief in God that was an inspiration to it. It's also an ironic idea that we put these two things in opposition because there are many scientists today, in fact some at your own university, who are believers in God, and some of them are very committed Christians. And it's also strange because historically, as the study of science has grown, as scientific knowledge has grown, belief in God hasn't diminished in the way that people might have expected. Back in 1915, they did a survey of people in science, and they discovered that about a third believed in God, about a third didn't, and about a third were not sure. In 1996, a very similar survey was done, and they discovered that the proportions were almost identical, even after 100 years of scientific advancements. So you might say, why is this an issue? Why do people therefore put this as a kind of a battle between science and faith and God? One of the reasons is that we've been presented with this kind of idea of this historical kind of narrative of this debate. If you look back, and I'll explain more in a moment, people have said, we're about over 100 years now, there's always been this conflict between science and faith. And that idea comes up and is regurgitated on documentaries and all sorts. And people talk about things like Copernicus or Galileo or people like that through history, and they say the church and religion have always been opposing scientific advancements. Second reason is people talk about this idea of the God of the gaps. They say, well, the problem with religion is it's just fitting God into the gaps of our scientific knowledge. So rewind 2,000 years, people might have said, well, we don't understand something like thunder and lightning. And so people would have said, well, maybe that was the gods having some kind of domestic in the heavens. And that's how we attribute what we don't understand. But they say, of course, now we understand all sorts of things we didn't used to understand, so we have less need for God. And if you kind of extrapolate forwards, you might say, well, if you fast forwards 2,000 years, or not even 2,000 years, but less than that, fast forwards, and you might say, well, as we understand more and more about science, there's less and less need for God. The gaps are being closed up in our knowledge. And then thirdly, and very popularly, people say, well, these things must be in conflict because of the theory of evolution. If you're going to believe the Bible, then clearly you're going to have to dismiss evolution. And if you're given the choice, we know where most people would fall on that one. Now, I guess in a room filled with I don't know how many people here, there are different people here. Some of you might be saying, well, science is the very reason why I have no time for God. And this is perhaps the primary reason for you dismissing God and belief in God. Might be that you're here and saying, well, actually, I don't think this whole thing's a load of rubbish. You might be saying, actually, I'm quite intrigued by the Christian faith. I'm quite intrigued by my Christian friends and the difference that it makes to their lives. But I just can't see how you could be a kind of intellectually satisfied Christian. How can I potentially myself become a Christian and not have to kind of leave my brain at the door? Or actually, you might be saying, well, actually, I do believe in God. Maybe you're saying I'm a Christian. But I struggle to reconcile these two parts of my life, my intellectual side, my studies, and God. So those are some of the reasons and some of the ideas behind it. Now, what might we say to it? Well, firstly, let's think about what we just said, this idea of this historical conflict, this grand narrative, that there's always been this debate or this conflict between science and God. That idea actually can be stemmed back to a couple of books by a couple of guys at the end of the 19th century called Draper and White, who wrote a couple of books, one of them called On the Conflict Between Science and Faith. So kind of pretty obvious what that was about. And these books kind of really tried to present this historical grand narrative of conflict between science and God. And the ideas that they present are regurgitated and repeated very often today. The problem is those two original books from the end of the 19th century have been completely discredited. Their research was, well, shoddy at best, you might say. And lots of the things that they cite in there have actually been shown to be false. And yet, this idea of this grand narrative, this conflict, kind of remains. I'll put it another way. Imagine if I was to say to you, for the last 2,000 years, there has been conflict between the nations of Egypt and Israel. Now, if I was to say that, what would be the problem with what I've just said? Well, think about it. The nations of Egypt and Israel haven't existed in their current form for the last 2,000 years. In fact, the modern idea of the nation state is quite a modern thing, isn't it? So if I say there's always been conflict between Egypt and Israel, well, what do I mean? There may have been conflicts within that region, but to say there has always been conflict between these two nations doesn't really make sense. Now, when people say there has always been conflict between science and religion, we have to ask the question, what do we mean by science? It's a kind of catch-all phrase. It's a relatively new thing. To kind of include a number of different disciplines. And what do we mean by religion? Again, all sorts of different worldviews, some of them theistic and some of them actually atheistic, could be contained within that view. So when we say there's always been conflict between science and religion, it doesn't really make sense historically. Here's the second thing. What about this idea of God of the gaps? People say, well, look, because God is used to explain the things we don't understand, the more we understand, the less we need God. I'll give you an illustration. I don't know whether you must have done by now. You must have used a Dyson hand dryer, okay? You know those Airblade hand dryers? Very exciting, aren't they? I remember when I first used a Dyson hand dryer, I have to say, I'd heard about them, and then when I walked into the toilet and I discovered this particular public toilet had them, I got very excited, because I'd heard they dry your hands in 10 seconds. And so I have to confess, I washed my hands twice to get the average time, just to check, to see if it really did dry my hands in 10 seconds. Like, normally hand dryers just send the water down your arms, don't they? But these hand dryers, they actually dry your hands. Now, imagine I look at this Dyson hand dryer and I say to myself, I don't understand how on earth a Dyson hand dryer can dry my hands in 10 seconds flat. I don't know how it happens. So I think there must be an explanation. And I noticed that it's called a Dyson hand dryer. So I come to the conclusion that actually there's a guy called Mr. Dyson who's a little man who lives inside the hand dryer. And when he hears the flush of the toilet, he springs into action, ready to run around, blowing really hard at my hands, so that my hands dry. Now, you could probably understand that that's not how a hand dryer works, okay? And if I was to take apart the hand dryer, I would, lo and behold, find that there isn't a little man called Mr. Dyson running around inside of it. So then I say, of course, now I can see the workings of the hand dryer. There is no such person as Mr. Dyson. He doesn't exist. Well, of course not. Mr. Dyson does exist. He's 70 years old. He lives in California. He's got over £1 billion to his name from selling all these overpriced vacuum cleaners and hand dryers and such like. He certainly exists. And just because I understand how the machine works doesn't remove the need for him. Mr. Dyson and the workings of his hand dryer are not contradictory explanations. They're complementary ones. Just as Henry Ford and the internal workings of a combustion engine are not contradictory explanations for the motor car, but complementary ones. We don't put these things against each other. And yet so often, people have. The late Christopher Hitchens once put it this way. He said, God has run out of justifications because our greatest microscopes and telescopes haven't found him. He's run out of justifications. But actually, according to the Christian worldview, you won't find God literally through a microscope or a telescope. He's not a God hiding behind Jupiter. He's not a God within his creation. He's a God of the whole show, not a God of the gaps. And if that's true, actually that affects our view of science, doesn't it? Because if God is the God of the whole show, not a God of the gaps, then as I understand more about science, it's not that my need for God gets smaller, but actually my appreciation of God gets bigger. Because, as it says above the Cavendish Laboratory, as we study things like science, we are studying the works of God. So that's why, historically, there have been many Christians that have been inspired, not in spite of their Christian faith, but because of their Christian faith, to do their science. Because they believe they're looking at the world God has made. Isaac Newton, when he wrote about the law of gravity, didn't say, look, now I've discovered how gravity works, I don't need God. He wrote Principia Mathematica, and in it he said, I'm trying to persuade the thinking person to believe in God. His understanding of how the gaps came together didn't dismiss his need for God, but it gave him greater appreciation of God. So don't look for God in the gaps. That's the second thing. What about this, though? Thirdly, this idea that evolution and the Christian faith have to be contradictory, and they can't fit together. That's often a choice that people present. You'll hear people like Richard Dawkins often saying, if you're going to be a Christian, you've obviously got to believe in a young earth that's 6,000 years old, created in 6 literal days, etc. Actually, one of the things you'll discover if you look into the Christian faith at all and you discover Christians at all is that Christians have different opinions. Yes, sure, there are some Christians who do hold that opinion, but certainly not all Christians. In fact, there are different opinions on it, and many Christians have no problem with reconciling their understanding of Genesis and the Bible with the theory of evolution. And they will fit those two things together. And by the way, that didn't just happen in response to the theory of evolution. It wasn't just that people have reinterpreted the Bible through history to try and fit with whatever science is saying, but actually that suggestion that the days of Genesis weren't necessarily 24-hour periods predates the theory of evolution by quite a few hundred years. Augustine said that, amongst others. So it's not necessarily a contradiction in the way that we think it might be. But actually, if we were to go beyond that, what I might say is this. The theory of evolution, if it's the only explanation for who we are, and if we are nothing but the products of evolutionary theory, and if there is no God, then actually, should we trust the products of our minds to tell us what's true or not? So think about it this way. If evolution is the only explanation for what we are and who we are today, then the driving force behind who we are has been survival of the fittest. Therefore, we might ask the question, if survival is the most important thing that has governed this process, why should truth be important? And if it had to come to a choice between truth and survival, surely survival is more important than truth. In other words, why should we trust that our brains have evolved to tell us what is true, and therefore, when my brain says that naturalism is true, why should I trust that? As much as if my brain says that God exists. It actually gives us some really serious doubts about things in general. Just listen to what Thomas Nagel said. He's professor of philosophy at New York University. He said, evolutionary naturalism implies that we should not take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. Or listen to Charles Darwin in one of his letters that he wrote to a friend. He said, but then with me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or are at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are convictions in such a mind? It's interesting stuff, isn't it? So actually, if this is all we've got, how do we trust the convictions of our minds at all? And should we? Even if my mind is telling me that God doesn't exist. So I don't think that evolution presents a problem to the Christian faith. You might say actually it presents a greater problem to the naturalistic worldview. But there's one final problem before we go to questions, and that's this. So often when we come to this issue of science and faith, one of the problems we have is we assume that science is not just a good way of knowing things to be true, but actually we go further than that and we say it's the only way to know things are true. So often people say things like, if you can't know it through science, it's not worth knowing. Now that's not actually what we call science, that's what we'd call scientism. This view that science is the only way to truth, the only way to reliable knowledge. Actually, it's a slightly arrogant view, isn't it? I'm sure in a room like this, you're not all studying the natural sciences. And it would be rather arrogant to say that your discipline, if it's not a natural science, is therefore not true or not an investigation into truth. There are all sorts of truths, mathematical truths, philosophical truths, historical truths that we don't come about through the simply kind of putting them in a test tube, as it were. There are lots of ways to discover truth. And in particular, when it comes to the Christian faith, this is important because at the centre of the Christian faith is not just a belief that God created the world, but as we'll think about particularly tomorrow, that God has stepped into the world in the person of Jesus Christ. Actually, the greatest reason I would say that I'm a Christian is not just that I'm persuaded that God created the world, but the God who created actually existed on planet Earth, stepped into human history in the person of Jesus Christ. And if that happens, then the way to discover whether it's true will be through historical investigation. That's what we're going to be doing tomorrow as we ask the question, is there any evidence for the reliability of the Gospels and the accounts of Jesus' life? See, it's not that science is useless, but just in that particular field, it's not going to be particularly helpful. We're going to want to ask historical questions, not just scientific ones. And lastly, before we go to questions, let me say this. If God is not just existing, but God is personal, as Christians describe him as being, actually the way to get to know a person is not just through investigation, but it's also through relationship, isn't it? Let me put the scenario out. Imagine I'm walking through Cambridge later this week, and I meet a girl, and she's particularly attractive, and so I decide to ask her out on a date. And so I say to her, hi, I'd really like to get to know you better. And I'm not doing anything tonight, so why don't we meet up tonight about 7 o'clock, just outside King's, and we'll go out. It'd be great to get to know you better. And lo and behold, she says yes and agrees to this proposition. And so she comes along, 7 o'clock tonight, probably expecting maybe, I don't know, a meal, drinks, a cinema date or something like that. And I come along, meet her at 7 o'clock and say, great, thanks so much for coming. We're just going to go round to the laboratory a moment, and we're going to start the investigation. First of all, I need to know your weight, and I can probably guess from that. I'm not going to ask your height, but I can probably work out your BMI. Secondly, is it really blonde hair, or is that fake? And thirdly, I need to know your blood type, so we'll do some blood tests on you, and so on. Now, you can understand, can't you, why I'm still single at the age of 33, when that is my view of how you get to know someone. It's not that you can't do that to a person, but a person is a lot more than just, a chemical composition. And if God exists, the wonder of it is this, that actually you can get to know him. And that's what we're encouraging people to do this week. To actually say, get to know the God who is there, who does exist, and actually that we can get to know him personally too. Now listen, we're going to go to questions. So why not text in if you haven't already, be thinking about that. Whilst we just get ready and Anna's on her way up, let me just mention a couple of things that might be really helpful. Firstly, could you just pick up this little card that's hopefully on the back of the pew in front of you? Have you got that? Pick it up. And hopefully there's a pen as well. It'd be really helpful if you could just pick that up. At very least, what we'd love is your comments about these events as they go on through the week. We'd love to know what you think of them, your thoughts and everything like that. So just leave some comments. You can say, lunch was great, speaker was rubbish, something like that. Now, there's a couple of boxes there. Don't worry about the first one for today, but the second one says, tell me more. All week, we really want to help people who really want to look into this and investigate these things further to do that. And if you tick the box, and if you leave your number, and say who you came with, if you come with a friend, but also, it doesn't say this, but your college, that'd be really helpful for us. If you fill out your details and tick that box, then we'll get in touch with you in the next 24 hours. The first thing you can do is we'll offer to meet you for a coffee. And so we'll buy the coffee and you can bring the questions and we can meet up and chat about this more. But we'll also let you know about some things that will happen after this week has finished that you might find really helpful. So if you could just fill that out now, leave some comments, say what you think. Do that anonymously if you want. But if you would like to find out more, if you are interested in discussing these things further, then tick the box and leave your details. The other thing to say is, as you head out in about 15 minutes, there's a couple of book tables. And if you're a guest of the Christian Union, so you don't normally come to one of the Christian Unions here in Cambridge, but you'd like to look into this more, there's a whole array of books there. Hopefully there'll be someone by it that can let you know what they're about. But there's one in particular, I should have brought it up, but I forgot, and it's called God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? By Professor John Lennox from Oxford University. So that's a really helpful book, despite his university, and we would gladly give that to you free of charge. The only condition is we'd like you to read it, okay, rather than use it to prop up your other books. So do have a look at the bookstall. There's some others there, including a couple that I wrote. Another book, and you don't even have to go to the bookstall, it's on the back of your pew, is this book, just simply called John. And that's an account of the life of Jesus Christ, written by one of the eyewitnesses, a guy called John. We're encouraging people to take this away. Later in the week, there's going to be some talks from this book in the evening. And tomorrow lunchtime, we'll be particularly asking the question of whether we can trust this as a historical source for the life of Jesus. But why not take it away and start reading in preparation for that? That's all I'm going to say. Let's go to the questions. Have we got any on the text to start us off?
Yeah, we've got a couple of texts which are on a similar theme, so about miracles in the Bible. So firstly, science cannot explain some stories in the Bible, such as Jesus walking on water, so can science and religion still be compatible? And similarly, how are you meant to... Oh, I've got so many coming in. Science cannot explain... that's the same one. Basically, miracles in the Bible.
Miracles in the Bible. Great. I was in Edinburgh last week, and Edinburgh is a famous place where David Hume lived, and a big statue of him at the top of the Royal Mile. And we were thinking about this last week because David Hume, perhaps more than anyone else, historically is well known for his putting forward a philosophical argument for the idea that miracles that they couldn't have happened and that they are contradictory to the laws of nature. In one sense, what I'd say is, actually, it is the laws of nature that allow us to identify a miracle. A miracle, by definition, is something that doesn't normally happen. The laws of nature describe what normally happen in nature. And by the way, actually, I think people 2,000 years ago, despite their lack of scientific knowledge, knew that dead people normally stay dead and people can't normally walk on water and things like that. It's not that we now know that they have to, they couldn't have happened. They also knew that these things don't normally happen, which is to describe the astonishment that they saw when they saw these things happening. But also I think it's quite helpful to say that the laws of nature describe what normally happen, but actually they describe what normally happens given no outside interference. To use an illustration that C.S. Lewis first put forwards. Lewis said, imagine I've got at home a drawer, and each week I put into that drawer £1,000. I wish I could do that. But for 4 weeks, you put in £1,000 each week, next week £1,000 and so on. After 4 weeks, he says, if I go back to my drawer and I discover that there's only £2,000 in my drawer, I don't say, gosh, the laws of England have been broken, the laws of arithmetic have been broken. He says, I say, the laws of England have been broken. Someone's been nicking my money. See? Now, you would normally expect it to be false, that someone's interfered. Now, if there is a God, I know you don't necessarily believe that, but if there was a God who got involved in history in the person of Jesus Christ, could that God get involved and uphold, as it were, what normally happens in other situations? Absolutely. Now, does that mean that because God has done that in the past, I always expect dead people to rise, a boys pack lunch to feed the 5,000 or whatever? No, of course not. And nor did the first followers of Jesus as well. So I don't see that there's a contradiction between those two things. And actually, you come to the conclusion that evidence are possible, I would suggest, through an investigation into the evidence for them, rather than a philosophical assumption about whether they're possible or not.